For this year's Enduro Bike of the Year test, we got together 10 of the best Enduro bikes we could find. Now these bikes range from bikes with just 146mm of travel through to 170mm of travel at the other end. And the prices range from £3,700 all the way up to £4,500. We went out and tested these bikes in a multitude of different conditions and on tons and tons of different trails. These range from off-piste natural stuff with roots and rocks through to the high-speed, super fast trails at Bike Park Wales, which were rough and rowdy. We also took some of the top contenders out to Spain, where we met up with the guys from Blacktown Trails who guided us around some phenomenal trails which are just 45 minutes outside of Madrid. And this let us really cement in our minds which ones were going to do really well and which ones weren't. So after many hours of back-to-back testing, we can now reveal the bike that came in second place, which is the Specialized Enduro Comp. This is the third time that I've done the Enduro Bike of the Year test, but for those that aren't quite familiar, we will be going through first, we're talking about the frame, then we'll go into the spec and the detail around that, and then finally I'm going to tell you about how the bike actually rides. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more independent reviews just like this one. Now the Enduro's been around for roughly 20 years, which is a hell of a long time for any bike to exist, but the design has changed significantly for 2020 compared to what we've been used to for the last, 10 years, where they've used and modified the same sort of X-Wing design as it's gone through 26-inch 650B and 29-inch wheels. So for 2020, the frame now is carbon only and works around 29-inch wheels, and there is 170mm of rear wheel travel. Specialized offer the Enduro in 4 sizes, ranging from S2 up to S5. So the S3 bike that I rode has a reach of 464mm, which is pretty big for what I would sort of consider like a medium, and a really short seat tube. So in theory then you should just be able to size up or down depending on what you're after in terms of reach. Now I've already mentioned that the design of the Enduro for 2020 differs quite a bit from the X-Wing design of the old frame. Now you can see that the shock sits much lower into the frame along with the accompanying links, which means all your weight's nice and low down by the bottom bracket. Specialized also have claimed to have increased the anti-squat by 40% and made more of a rearward axle path. That's in order to help it carry more momentum and get hung up less on square edge hits and things like that. It still uses the Horselink design, and in this case on the Comp model it uses a RockShox Super Deluxe Select rear shock. Specialized only offer the Enduro in carbon. Now that's a carbon front triangle and carbon rear triangle, and on the S-Works model you also get carbon links to save a few hundred extra grams. From what we've heard, Specialized don't plan to offer this frame in alloy, which may explain why the price is quite high of even just the Comp model at £4,499. I've already touched on how the reach for this size is quite impressively long. It's also slack as well. And even though this bike has 2 settings, a high and a low, which is dictated by a little chip at the base of the shock, in its highest setting, which is the one that I actually settled on in the end, the head angle still measures at 64.3 degrees, which is super slack. Stick it into the lower setting and that head angle goes sub 64, which is pretty wild. Altering between the settings also means the bottom bracket moves up and down depending on which setting you're sat in. So in the highest setting, I measured my bottom bracket to sit at 346mm above the ground. By lowering it, you're going to take off 7mm, so it'll sit just under 340. And although it should make cornering even better and more confident, may mean if you're, averse to pedal strikes, things like that, you may end up battering your cranks into rocks and roots if you haven't timed things properly. Now, if you're not a fan of riding within a pack, the Enduro could be the bike for you. Not only has it got the conceal tool, which sits under a swiveling cap on the steerer tube of the fork, there's also the swap box, which sits within the down tube. So all you need to do is just open up the door that sits underneath the bottle cage, and you've got enough room to stow a tube and any other essentials in there. I actually once left a half-eaten burrito in mine for a number of days and it stank, so don't do that. Other nice little touches on the frame include all the integrated rubberized protection. So you've got it on the belly of the bike, so right under the bottom bracket and at the end of the down tube, just to protect it against rock strikes and other trail debris. And then there's also the integrated protection on the chainstay. So if you take a close look, it isn't just a normal flat chainstay protector. It's actually shaped whereby it should, in theory, help quieten down that chain slap and stop the chain moving quite so much. The Comp is the cheapest of all the Enduro lineup, and at £4,500, unfortunately, the NX transmission is a little disappointing. That's not because it doesn't work, because it does, and it doesn't work too badly at all. My point here is more around value, where we've got some bikes here which are significantly cheaper and have much better transmissions bolted onto. And another thing worth noting is that it uses the NX Eagle cassette. Now, there's nothing wrong with that either, but on a bike designed for performance and things like that, where you're looking to get any kind of marginal benefits you possibly can, especially when you consider the cost of it, this cassette has a slightly, I mean marginally, narrower range with an 11 to 50 tooth cassette. And it's also quite a bit heavier. So you're looking at 600 grams for this piece alone. Just for now, I am going to stick with the negatives, and now it's the turn of the tyres. Again, they're not awful by any stretch of the imagination. They're pretty decent actually, especially in soft mud. But compared to something like the Maxxis Mini and DHR2, which is one of my favourites, they don't feel quite as predictable. Now, the Butchers come in the grid trail carcass, which isn't super tough. And the problem there again is that this bike does make you want to ride it super fast, or as fast as you're willing to ride, and in the ugliest terrain possible. And I found on some occasions when I maybe went offline a little bit or was a little less calculated in my approach to, I don't know, certain rock sections, if I hung up a tyre, chances are I'd flat it. This doesn't come set up tubeless either. So it's worth bearing in mind you might need to spend a bit of cash converting and potentially changing these tyres to something a little bit tougher that will really do this bike justice. There are a lot of positives though, and I have to include a mention for the RockShox Lyric Select, which is up front obviously, which uses the shorter offset, and it also comes with the Charger RC damper, which is a really solid performer. This is then matched with the RockShox Super Deluxe Select Shock out back. And finally, another highlight for me are the SRAM Code R brakes, which always seem to deliver when you need the most, really powerful and plenty of bite even in the wet, which we've had a lot of recently. Actually setting up the Enduro doesn't take long, and just by going roughly by my standard sort of sag setup for shock and fork, I was out on the trail in no time at all. The only things I may have tweaked slightly were the bar height, just because the Enduro does feel like quite a big bike. 170mm of travel, big wheels and a nice long reach, and you feel like you're almost on a downhill bike for the most part. Once you throw a leg over the bike and realise that the back end is actually really supple and planted, you'd be surprised to realise it actually climbs uphill really well. There's very little in the way of suspension bob when you're sat down pedalling, and with the seat angle at 76 degrees and a stretched out effective top tube of 619mm on the S3 size that I rode, you actually feel like you've got a decent amount of room and you're in a good position to just crank on up and winch all the way up the hill without really having any problems at all. One slight issue I did have was that I couldn't actually get the X-Fusion Manic post to sit deep enough into the seat tube to run the saddle at full height when I wanted to sit down and pedal. I've actually ridden and spent quite a lot of time on the S-Works version of the Enduro, which comes with the Fox factory post. And on that, I had absolutely no issue of using the full 150mm drop on that post and could run it at full height. So it just means that the X-Fusion Manic post just won't get quite far enough into the seat tube for my little legs to run it at full height. I mean, we're only talking a few millimeters and it wouldn't be the end of the world. And chances are when I carry on testing this, all I'm going to do is swap to a really low profile saddle, which should hopefully remedy this. After spending time in both the low and high settings, I ended up riding the bike in the higher setting. That's just because it felt that bit more urgent through the turns, and it didn't seem to hold it back when it was pointed fully downhill. The Enduro manages to deliver its 170mm of travel super smoothly, and even when you do bottom it out, it's never harsh. You never feel like you're hanging up on anything, and it doesn't ever feel like you're getting a whack through the frame when you do clout into something, even if you've gone offline and things are getting pretty wild. This gave me the confidence to just take some ludicrous lines that otherwise I might have shied away from. So this bike is seriously impressive, and probably comes closest to riding a downhill bike of any of the bikes in this test. And that's a real bonus because although the tyres are decent enough in that soft mud that we mentioned already, when it gets to hard pack stuff or when you're really trying to hold an edge on a dry, loose turn, the tyres don't feel quite as confident or predictable. Thankfully though, both the fork and the back end of the bike are extremely supple and it helps keep everything glued to the ground. The back wheel tracks the terrain almost faultlessly. As a result, there's a ton of traction where you otherwise might have thought there shouldn't be. Obviously though, not every single track is going to be super steep or really high speed, and on the mellower trails, the Enduro is marginally harder work than, say, the white G170 for example. And because that back end is so supple and generates so much traction, when you are trying to pump the bike to generate speed or at least maintain it, it means that the Enduro doesn't feel quite as urgent when compared to the white G170, which just feels that bit more direct when you're trying to pump through the undulations. But that's not to say that you can't still load the bike heavily as you pop from turn to turn, and the Enduro does rail a turn really well. With all the weight down so low, it feels really confident and sure-footed, and it always feels like it's generating as much grip as possible. And change the tyres for something that bit stickier and it would be phenomenal. In terms of suspension balance from front to rear, the Enduro does feel great. I personally think it could do with maybe having some tunable low-speed compression at the rear just to try and make it a little more lively through some of the flatter sections of trail. But as long as it wouldn't detract then from just how capable it is when you're pointed downhill, because seriously, this thing flies. To conclude, the Enduro Comp is such a capable bike that I think it exudes almost the same level of confidence you'd only get from riding a downhill bike. It might not have the flashiest spec out there, and if we're going to be really picky, okay, yeah, the NX Eagle isn't the most draw-worthy of transmissions out there. It does the job and it does it okay, but it isn't the slickest or the smoothest. But still, as a package, this bike is incredible when pointed downhill. It does take a bit of work on flatter or mellower trails to keep it moving, but if you've got gravity on your side, the smooth suspension and impressive geometry of the Enduro is really hard to beat. As always, let us know what you think of the Enduro Comp in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you'll always be notified anytime we upload a new video.